Welcome to the Daily Report. It's Wednesday, March 9th, which is also the 20th presidential election day here in Korea. I'm Min Sun-hee. Early voting this past Friday and Saturday saw record numbers of voters, even as health authorities here fight their worst wave of COVID-19 infections. With more on both the presidential race and the pandemic lined up today. Let's begin with the COVID-19 coverage. I have Kwon So standing by with the latest tallies.
Sunny, not only does the presidential election fall on a Wednesday, but also Wednesday is usually when we have been seeing record high infections as the figures tend to rise by the middle of the work week. And in fact, this Wednesday, there's been another all-time high here. For the first time here in the country, over 300,000 infections were posted, more than 342,000 to be exact, as of 12 a.m. this Wednesday. And that also includes more than 342,000 domestic transmissions with a double-digit figure of imported cases. And if we take a look at our graph, you do see this huge jump from the day before and also compared to last Wednesday when we have just gotten above the 200,000 mark. And taking a closer look at where the infections are breaking out across the nation, we are seeing at least four-digit figure numbers and record highs in many places. Gyeonggi-do province here at over 96,600 infections in just a day, and also the capital is Seoul with more than 74,000 cases. And if we go over to the total number of cases now having also surpassed the 5 million mark with 5.2 million accumulated COVID-19 infections and another triple-digit number of fatalities. And the number of patients that remain in severe or critical condition has also been going up, the number, and here for the second straight day at above 1,000. On to our vaccination figures. We've got 44.8 million and 44.4 million of the nation's population that got either their first COVID-19 vaccine dose or their second one, or are considered fully vaccinated. And with a little over 40,000 people who got their additional dose on the day before, that's now 31.9 million of the nation's population. Let's also take a check on the global figures. There's been a rise by 1.7 million new infections as of noon Korea time and a little over 8,600 COVID-19 related deaths. And onto the countries that have accumulated so far the highest numbers of caseloads. There's been a milestone again here in the U.S. Although there have been some decreases lately, the U.S. now has hit the 81 million mark in total infections. And we also have just lately Germany having surpassed 16 million, and South Korea now has become the 19th country with the highest number, the country with the 19th highest number of infections in the world, that is. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for the global tallies over the past 24 hours. As mentioned earlier, Korea's daily tally hit another record high on this Wednesday, and Choi Min-jung is here with details on that. Min-jung, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Sunny.
Right, so let's start with this grim milestone.
Right, as Soa mentioned, the country's daily infections surpassed 300,000 for the very first time, and that's a jump by a whopping margin of 140,000 cases over a single day period. Korea's total case count has now surpassed 5.2 million, meaning 1 in 10 people in South Korea has had or currently has COVID-19. The country passed the 4 million mark last weekend, and it only took 4 days for the 5 million mark to be hit. Dr. Jung Jae-hoon, a government COVID-19 advisor, says the peak phase of Korea's Omicron wave may have started on this Wednesday, lasting over the next 2 weeks. Therefore, he said the country must prepare itself to handle the expected surge in severely ill patients at the end of March or early April. As of Wednesday, 59% of ICU beds are in use nationwide, and by region, 55% are filled in the capital area, with the figure at 69% for areas outside the Greater Seoul area. Meanwhile, the number of people recovering at home is now over 1.2 million, following a jump of 54,000 over the past day.
And in light of the latest events, Min-jung, I understand health authorities are now making Pfizer's antiviral pill available at more medical centers across the country.
That's right, Sunny. Starting today, Paxlovid prescriptions for COVID-19 patients will become available at general hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, and rehab centers nationwide. Up until now, oral pills could only be prescribed by hospitals specialized in respiratory care, infectious diseases, and home treatment, among others. And also today, another 45,000 courses of Paxlovid will arrive in the country, which means the country has so far received 163,000 courses. The treatment was first introduced in mid-January and has been administered to more than 25,000 people as of last Friday, mostly to people recovering at home.
Meanwhile, on the testing front, Minjung, PCR requirements for inbound travelers are poised to change, I hear. Tell us about that.
Right. Authorities have decided to ease its mandatory PCR testing requirements amid the crunch in the country's testing capacity. Inbound travelers will no longer have to get 2 PCR tests, and on the day of arrival and the 7th day after arriving. From tomorrow, which is Thursday, PCR tests will only be required on the first day of arrival, and on the 7th day, people will be asked to take a rapid antigen test instead. Testing guidelines have also been relaxed for people working at nursing facilities. Those who have gotten their 4th shots will no longer be subject to weekly PCR testing, and PCR testing for new military recruits entering boot camp will also be reduced from twice upon entry to just once prior to entry.
Right, so before they're recruited then. Let's move on to the academic arena, Minjung, where many schools are holding in-person classes despite the alarming rebound in cases.
Right. The new school semester began last week, and figures showed that 88% of schools nationwide are holding in-person classes. The Education Ministry recommended schools to resume normal classes this semester, but schools were given the choice to decide on their own class format depending on the virus situation. And it turned out the majority were holding in-person classes, while around 9% chose a hybrid format of physical and remote learning. But this comes as more than 174,000 students were infected with COVID-19 over a 6-day period following their return to school. This means an average of 29,000 students were infected a day. That's already half the total number of student infections confirmed in the entire year of 2021. And with cases increasing among the faculty as well, education authorities in the capital region are allowing infected teachers with mild symptoms to teach online from home while they recover.
Right, and Minjung, beyond Korea, I hear some countries are easing their border restrictions. Tell us about that.
Right, Sunny. India will be resuming international flights for the first time since the start of the pandemic. Since March 2020, international flight services were suspended, and special flights only operated for 37 countries under the travel bubble agreement. However, the government has decided to ease travel measures from March 27th, thanks to its high vaccination coverage and the relatively having the Omicron wave now under control. And in January, the country saw around 340,000 daily cases, but now this figure has dropped to around 3,000.
Right, meaning they are past their peak then. All right, Minjung, thank you for the pandemic coverage. I'll see you on Thursday.
Thank you.
Right, up next, polling stations for the 20th presidential election open doors at 6 a.m. on this Wednesday across the nation. And to share with you some of the actual scenes, our Chun Song-cho joins us now. Song-cho, welcome.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
Right, so you are at a polling station in southern Seoul, Song-cho.
Right, I'm just outside a polling station in Yangjae-dong, Seocho-gu district in southern Seoul, because today is the day, the election day. Today, South Koreans are voting for a new president, and the weather for today is sunny and warm, and absolute perfect weather for voting, I must say. Since voting began at 6 a.m. this morning, mask-wearing voters waited in long lines outside polling stations across the country, really reflecting the high turnout rate that we've been seeing these days. It's a little past 2 o'clock right now here in Seoul, and I'm continuously seeing people going in and out of this building, the Yangjae Social Welfare Center that's been turned into a polling station. So voting will continue until 6 p.m. today, and this is how things will play out. So when you arrive at a polling station, you get your temperature checked, and then you disinfect your hands, and then you wait in line while keeping a distance from others who are also waiting in line, and also trying not to talk unless it's absolutely necessary. And then when it's your turn, the poll worker will ask you to ask for your identification card, and also ask you to pull down your mask just briefly to check your identity. And then you check your name on register, and you receive your ballot, and you cast your vote. And now you may be wondering, what about those people who have been infected with COVID-19 or who are undergoing quarantine right now? Do they still get to vote? Well, absolutely, yes. Definitely, because everyone has every single right to cast their ballots for the future president. But they must do so sometime between 6 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. after everyone else has finished voting. The government went as far as to revise the election law, enabling the extension of voting hours just for the pandemic. But to keep everyone safe, the people who have been infected with COVID-19 or are suspected of having one are told not to take public transportation on the way to the polling station. And then also they are asked to return home immediately after they finished voting. Also, one more reminder for everyone. I've been seeing a lot of people uploading pictures that they took at polling stations and sharing them on social media. But you have to remember that you cannot take pictures inside a polling station. You can get fined up to $3,000 or sentenced to 2 years in prison. If you want to take a selfie, do so, take it outside of the polling station. But I think it's really good that you want to share your experience and encourage others to go out there and vote as well, because voting is not just a right, but also a civic duty. If you're unsure of which polling station to go, then you can look it up online at the National Election Commission website. And don't forget to bring your identification card as well. This has been Chun Sung-cho reporting live from Yangjae-dong, and back to you, Sunny, in the studio.
All right, Song-cho, thank you for that coverage and your words of caution. The new administration has a host of issues to tackle as it enters office this coming May. Among them is COVID-19, as well as its related repercussions. For more, I have Soa back at the desk. Soa.
Hi again, Sunny.
Right, so we're hosting a presidential election amid a pandemic that looks to take priority on the new president's to-do list, right, sir?
Right, Sunny. It's uncertain for now how the COVID-19 situation will look like in May once the new administration takes office. Now, what's almost certain, though, is that the impact of this health crisis, which has gone on for more than 2 years, will linger and will have to be dealt with as a major priority by the next government. Now, more on this in my report.
Korea's pandemic response was inevitably a topic that was high on the list of pledges by the country's presidential candidates for the March 9th election. What all of them agree with is that our virus prevention measures took a heavy toll on ordinary citizens as well as small businesses, in the latter case, especially financially.
The people had to take on too many responsibilities for the country due to COVID-19, so we have to make up for their losses in the past, and also the losses they may incur in the future.
Because the losses have been inflicted upon the self-employed and micro-businesses owners by state policies, they need to be swiftly compensated in accordance with the Constitution.
The two leading candidates, Lee Jae-myung of the ruling Democratic Party and Yoon Sung-yeol of the main opposition People Power Party, have different opinions on how to help those who suffer damages. Lee wants to provide universal COVID-19 relief funds, while Yoon says cash handouts should be focused on assisting those who were affected the most by pandemic restrictions. Shim Sang-jung of the minor Progressive Justice Party vowed to overcome the COVID-19 crisis by calling on the wealthy to bear a greater burden of the pandemic impact. Almost half of the nation's people believe that the next administration's focus should be on revitalizing the economy. 46.7% of 1,021 respondents aged 18 and above said so, according to this recent survey. When asked about how to alleviate economic uncertainties stemming from COVID-19, 39.5% said through stabilizing prices, followed by stabilizing real estate supply at 31.8%. In a different survey, improving the real estate market and support for COVID-19 damages were the top two policy tasks that were sought by the respondents. Economy and pandemic challenges are likely to go hand in hand with the upcoming administration. Further tasks also lie ahead for healthcare and medical policies. Expanding public health services and increasing the number of doctors and other medical personnel is a view that is shared by major candidates. The DP's Lee Jae-myung is looking for the establishment of a national graduate school of health and medical science, while rivals Yoon Suk-yeol and Sim Sang-jung have leaned towards bolstering the country's existing medical schools. The next administration will also have to consider whether to maintain or revise Moon Jae-in Care, a policy to expand health insurance coverage. It has been found that the prolonged pandemic reduced the use of medical services, leading to a surplus in the state health insurance. Policies to expand research and development in the biotech and pharmaceutical industries will likely be addressed as well. The Democratic Party and Justice Party promised to secure vaccine sovereignty, and the People Power Party vowed to designate the biopharmaceutical industry as one of Korea's 5 strategic sectors. The Korea Pharmaceutical and Biopharma Manufacturers Association says aggressive spending is required for Korea to elevate its status as a pharmaceutical powerhouse, in line with the outgoing administration's goal to become a vaccine hub to not only deal with COVID-19, but also prepare for future health crises in the long term. After all, what's expected from the new president is a coherent post-pandemic response. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
Right, now, as you reported in your story, that is, pandemic-related tasks remain on the table for the incoming administration. But what are some of the more urgent issues that need to be addressed amid the spread of Omicron?
Well, Sunny, first, the incumbent Moon Jae-in administration will have some final tasks in regards to handling with the current COVID-19 situation, getting the nation's people safely through the elections, of course, and also the Omicron peak that's expected to happen within 2 or 3 weeks if earlier predictions prove to be right. So the transition period, thus preparation time, will be crucial, as it's not certain how many infections exactly we'll be seeing in the coming weeks, how many people will be in critical condition, and also whether medical capacity will be strained or not.
Right, and there are also questions too about who will be appointed to lead the next administration's response to the pandemic, right?
Right, Sunny, and depending on who is elected, there might be drastic changes and maybe not. Presidential candidates have been critical of the Moon administration's handling of the Omicron variant, although credit was also given by some for the government's response to the pandemic in the early stages, when Korea focused on aggressive testing, tracing, and treatment. The next administration taking power may also come with new officials being appointed in the health ministry, the drug ministry, the KDCA, as well as a panel of government officials and experts that is in charge of finding ways to live with COVID-19 measures, which have been suspended just a month after its introduction in November last year. So if Omicron turns out to be the last big hurdle in this pandemic, what the next administration will have to contemplate on is how to lift social distancing measures and also how to allow citizens to safely return to their normal lives.
Right, I'm sure a return to any form of normality will be welcomed by all. So thank you very much for your report.
My pleasure. See you on Thursday.
In our headlines at this hour, navigating through the current climate of international affairs, especially amid Russia's military campaign in Ukraine, stands to be a major task for the incoming administration as it seeks to address North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Our Kim Dami explains.
The peace process on the Korean Peninsula may be another wild ride for the new administration, with the possibility of a new Cold War dominating internationally. Laying solid momentum for North Korea's complete denuclearization will still remain top of the agenda for Seoul, but this time with an additional variable, the Russia-Ukraine crisis.
It is possible that North Korea may have given up on its willingness to denuclearize while watching the Ukraine crisis. So the situation could be an opportunity for the North to solidify its will to keep nuclear weapons.
Instead, the value and the importance of the South Korea-US alliance is bound to become more significant, as resolving North Korea issues through Seoul-Washington ties will highly likely be the go-to solution. But experts say such a plan will only work if the Biden administration listens to the new administration.
The U.S. needs to respect South Korea's opinions when it comes to issues on the Korean Peninsula, such as economic cooperation between the two Koreas and reunions of war-separated families.
Seoul-Beijing relations may become trickier in the new administration amid a new Cold War structure that will no doubt focus on keeping both China and Russia in check. But experts point out that South Korea-China cooperation will remain essential for improving the situation on the Korean Peninsula. The same applies to ties between South Korea and Japan. However, a rocky road is expected, with Tokyo refusing to look squarely at history and show a humble attitude over its wartime past. In addition, managing people's sentiment over this tragic history will remain another crucial task for the new government. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Also on the political front, young swing voters are expected to play a decisive role in the 20th presidential election. That being said, our Kim Bo-kyung covers the efforts made by the leading candidates to better appeal to this specific group.
The swing voters. That is how the MZ generation, the millennials and Generation Z, are being viewed in this election. Millennials are those who were born from 1982 to 1997 and became adults in the 2000s. Generation Z are those born after 1998. According to the National Election Commission, around 14 million of the roughly 44 million voters are in the MZ generation bracket. That is around 1 in every 3 voters, not a small number the candidates can overlook.
We have seen the huge impact these voters can have when they vote collectively during previous by-elections, so we consider them as key swing voters who can change the course of the election if they support one specific candidate.
The candidates have come up with campaign strategies to try to win over young voters. Rather than just campaigning on the streets, they are sharing their policies and proposals online.
Having their own online platform to appeal to digital-friendly voters is a must. The ruling Democratic Party's Lee Jae-myung has his own online platform, Jae-myung's Village, offering hundreds of vertical short-form videos. Yoon Suk-yeol from the main opposition People Power Party has launched today's Yoonzip, filled with short video clips of his pledges and speeches, and Wiki Yoon, inviting people to openly add suggestions for pledges they want. Knowing about the MZ generation's interests is important too. One of those interests is personality typology, especially the Myers-Briggs type indicator.
The MZ generation have their own beliefs and pursue their own style. Of course, candidates could be popular by coming up with policies, but the intimacy factor too is very important. To those in their 20s and 30s, a candidate who has a similar personality as them could be very appealing.
Candidates' strategies incorporated this. He prepared a JMBTI test presenting customized policies to voters with different personalities, and Yoon introduced his MBTI, emphasizing he is a just social activist type. Candidates no longer only appear on public TV networks. They are on OTT platforms too. Local streaming platform Coupang Play's comedy sketch show Saturday Night Live Korea has featured interviews with both Lee Jae-myung and Yoon Suk-yeol, asked them questions that they hadn't seen beforehand and catching them off guard. Comedian Hong Jin-young's study-themed YouTube channel, Study King Real Genius, even showed the presidential candidates teaching math.
In the election, it is important to improve favorability through intimacy, eventually leading to more loyalty when people vote, In that sense, format cannot be ignored. Getting closer to young voters through OTT platforms and social media makes the candidates look friendly and interactive.
Presidential candidates are not the only ones trying to use online channels to reach voters. These MZ generation voters are also using social media this election.
Casting a ballot and coming out from the polling station is not the final step for tech-savvy young voters. Celebrating their participation, they often whip out phones and share their ballot selfies through social media.
People post photos of their hands with ballot stamp marks on social media.
I am proving that I voted, and I can also encourage my friends to vote.
By doing this, candidates and politicians would know that those in their 20s and 30s are interested in voting and can come up with policies for this generation.
Using online platforms or going on YouTube is one thing, but what could be key for these candidates to connect with young voters is whether they can show their sincerity. And if they can do that, it could help them in the polling booths. 김보경, Arirang News.
On the international front, Moscow is poised to prohibit exports of, quote, certain commodities to certain countries. Details will be disclosed in the near future. The ban follows a similar move by Washington on energy imports from Russia. Shin reports.
A few hours after the U.S. announced new economic sanctions against Russia for invading Ukraine, Moscow responded with sanctions of its own. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday said they too would ban the exports of certain commodities and raw materials. Details on exactly which products will be banned have not yet been revealed, but they will be announced in the next 2 days. The U.S. said earlier on Tuesday that it would ban imports of Russian oil, natural gas, and coal in a bid to deprive Russia of economic resources as war in Ukraine rages.
We're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy. That means Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at U.S. ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine.
Following Biden's announcement, the UK proposed phasing out Russian oil imports by the end of 2022. The EU also said it would cut Russian oil imports by 2/3. Following Russia's tit-for-tat on Tuesday, pundits forecast that households around the world will suffer from a spike in wholesale prices. This comes as Russia is the world's second-largest exporter of crude oil and a key player in grains and metal exports. Despite the sanctions, Russia has not stepped back from its invasion of Ukraine. Moscow did, however, offer another ceasefire from 10 a.m. Wednesday local time to provide humanitarian corridors for Ukrainian civilians in Kyiv and 4 other cities to safely escape. This follows the first successful evacuation through an agreed corridor on Tuesday, when some 5,000 fled from the city of Sumy. The UN says Russia's invasion has caused the fastest-growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. As of now, more than 2 million people have left Ukraine. Shin, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. They say on International Women's Day you give bread and roses. Unfortunately for many women around the world, they were instead met with violence. Over in Turkey, riot police clashed with protesters who gathered in Istanbul to celebrate the day as police used pepper spray to disperse a crowd of several thousand in the city's center. Istanbul's governor's office said Monday that it would not allow marches, protesters, or press statements to mark the event in the area. However, women still gathered despite the heavy police presence, leading to scuffles and riot police using their shields to push them back. Meanwhile, over in Sudan, protesters used International Women's Day to rally against military rule, and they were met with tear gas as they approached the presidential palace. Women's rights groups had called for the protest, along with other organizations, as they have been holding rallies since the military took power in October. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said Tuesday that it has successfully put a second military satellite into orbit. The Noor-2 was placed into orbit 500 kilometers above Earth and follows their first military satellite, which was launched in April 2020. The Noor-1 was placed in orbit 425 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The announcement comes after talks were held in Vienna to revive an agreement restraining Iran's nuclear program. Experts say putting a second satellite in space would be a major advance for Iran's military, raising concerns about the country's nuclear and missile programs. Flood warnings continued across Australia's east coast on Tuesday, while tens of thousands of Sydney residents fled their homes overnight as torrential rains slammed the region once again. The country's eastern rivers were close to overflowing, following record downpours over the recent weeks, which cut off towns and swept away farms, livestock, and roads. Meanwhile, the death toll from the week-long floods rose to 20 after the bodies of a man and a woman were discovered in floodwaters. The National Weather Bureau warned of a tough 48 hours ahead for Sydney, with 60,000 people subject to evacuation orders. Batgirl and Flash were among thousands of superheroes seen at the 10th edition of the Middle East Film and Comic Convention in Abu Dhabi. Known as the biggest pop culture show in the region, it brought together nearly 22,000 people for the three-day event. Among the celebrity guests attending the event were Charles Martinet, the voice of Mario in the Super Mario video game series, as well as actress Ming-Na, who voiced Mulan from the animated Disney movie. But most importantly, for comic fans, it was a chance to dress up as their favorite characters. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
In our panel session on this election day, we delve further into the major tasks facing the new administration, which will take office in May. For more, I am visiting Professor An Jun-sung from Yonsei University. Professor An, welcome back.
Thank you.
I also have Professor Cho Hee-kyung at Hongik University live on the line. It's good to see you again, Professor Cho.
It's good to see you too.
Professor An, over 16 million people, roughly 37% of the total electorate, took part in 2 days of early voting late last week. What is your outlook with regard to voter turnout during this particular presidential election?
Yes, that's correct. That's the exactly 36.93% to be exact, right? And it is the highest rate since the early voting system has been introduced to Korea in 2014, and is more than 10% higher than the previous nationwide general election. So, put another way, is more than 1 out of 3 Korean voters have already participated, which constitutes more than 16 million people. That's, I think, is a remarkable number, and it's sending some message to the, not only the political community, to the general public. And then I think that there's two main reasons. Basically, the people Korean people get used to the early voting system, obviously. And second is there's a growing concern about the pandemic COVID-19 situation, especially with the Omicron variant, right? That's very serious issues. And interestingly, the two leading political parties have their own interpretation in their favor. In psychology, it is called like confirmation bias. Means that whatever they want to believe, they just believe whatever they want to believe, right? So they don't really listen to the other side, and you look at something bright side, only emphasize on one partial view, and they come up with their own, own answers. So I think that's the one we have to wait and see what really happened. Later tonight, we'll figure out, what really happened and what public want to happen in Korea in future.
Right, and Professor Cho, of course, this particular presidential election, it's the first to include the votes of 18-year-old Koreans. Having said that, what more can you tell us about the changing voter demographics here in the country?
Well, first of all, the number of people with the right to vote has actually increased by 1.7 million since the last presidential election. So we now have over 44 million people who are enfranchised to vote in this election. And this time, 18-year-olds are able to vote for the first time, and their numbers are in the 500,000 or so. So it's actually quite a sizable group that we cannot discount. But still, by far, the largest demographic group are the people in their 40s and 30s, accounting for around 19.5% and 18.5% respectively. So that's a very large chunk, almost a third. And then, more than a third. And then comes the over 60s group at nearly 17%. And in fact, that demographic has had increased significantly, as is wont to do in a rapidly aging society like ours. Then the people in their 20s and 30s take up 15% each. Now, it used to be that younger voters would vote more progressively and the older voters would vote more conservatively. But that equation no longer holds true, as we saw very clearly in the last Busan and Seoul mayoral elections. And even in this election, the people in their 20s and 30s, many pundits are saying, are really holding the casting vote. And in fact, it's the young females in their 20s and 30s who really seem to hold the deciding vote this election. So it's really, I think, anybody's game still. And this is why everyone is watching with bated breath for the result.
Right, we are, of course. Professor An, let's now touch upon some of the presidential pledges made by the top two leading contenders. On the political front, both candidates have called for reform of the so-called imperial presidency. Do tell us a bit about this terminology and its reality here in the country, as well as the changes proposed and their feasibility.
It's a very interesting question because in Korean politics, it's a very common expression, right? The imperialistic, presidency, right? And basically, it's about something about the separation of power. Something like compared to U.S., more like systematically, there's more separation, more guarantees, and check and balance system. But however, relatively speaking, but Korean is that in terms of political system, and there's more concentration of power in the one single person. So there's many politicians complain about the system, and that they like to change it. For example, like the Democratic Party candidate Lee Jae-myung saying that he would like to change the current single-term president system to the double term, just like a U.S. system. However, which was also promised by the former president Park Geun-hye, 5 years ago, right? 5 years ago. And then the other side, the People's Power Party's candidate Yoon Suk-yeol said they wanted relocation of the presidential office to the Gwanghwamun place, or the downsizing his office as well. But which is the promise also made by the current president Moon Jae-in, 5 years ago, right? I think 5 years ago, right? So what happened was that they kind of a cliche to the people. Now people just think, too many things that open they talk about it, nothing haven't changed. So I guess that now whatever they make a promise or campaign pledge, and there's kind of a suggestion, perhaps they can have a timeline. Perhaps I will do something within 2 years of my term, something very specific timeline would be my help, or prevent them making too many big promises which they not keep it.
Right, so people perhaps want to see more action than words.
Yeah.
Professor Cho, what are some of the presidential pledges that have been shared with the interests of young voters at heart?
Both of the two main leading candidates have made lots of promises for young people in their campaigns. But what struck me was the fact that for them, at least at the beginning, young people seem to equate to young men. And so there were lots of pledges regarding young male voters, things like giving them bonus points for having served in the military, increasing conscripts' wages, getting rid of women and family ministry, and somehow using their budget to improve welfare for young males, increasing punishment for the crime of false accusation, which is often used by those accused of sexual offenses against victims. And these kind of policies were all, they seem to be specifically designed to appeal to young male voters. And it was very difficult to see policies that were designed for female voters. It was almost as if young female voters didn't really seem to feature in the equation. It was only in the last few days that the Progressive Party candidate Lee Jae-myung started talking more about young female voters and trying to appeal to them, because he realized that, this is a demographic that who could actually be possibly for him. Whereas Yoon, to the very last, really went out of his way to state that he's not a feminist. And so there were a lot of policies that were specifically targeted at young voters, but it was very much gender skewed for the most part.
Right. And moving forward, Professor An, pension reform appears to have been a common pledge among the presidential candidates this time around, given Korea's low birth rate and aging population. Having said that, what are some of the possible solutions?
Yeah, for that question, I remember watching TV debate on an issue, and then they kind of make consensus, right? Say, everybody's agreed there, right there, to agree to reform the current system. Problem is that actually in reality, it's more important how you do it, right? Sometimes it's easier to do it the directions, but the problem was that here, this election is quite different from our previous one. I mean, the general elections. What happened was that it's about the gender issue and the generation issue. And although there was a more gender issue for this election, but there's still a generation issue, which is such like a pension plan, because it will be depends on how old you are, right? It depends on the age and your future benefit. The pension benefit will be changed, and there's a lot of critics about how we're going to reform it, or But there's a lot of things, and whoever become a next president will handle the situation. But this is a social issue. It affects every single Korean. It means that really, really big problem. So whoever elected, and they have listened to everybody and try to find it. The problem is here is a social issue is a sharing of pie. If someone getting more and someone getting less. So that if you do the president, whoever the future president have to do it, handle it, how are you gonna compromise whatever they lost for someone who have to give up something, and give if you want to give something to some class of people, and means that you're not that much of money is not going to there, or unless if you want to give the same amount of pie, but same pie means that you have to get more taxes. That's really a bigger problem. So I think that's things I'm concerned about the pictures, right?
Right. It remains a very difficult task. Professor Cho, on the labour front, a major challenge for the incoming administration will be addressing the hardships of irregularly employed workers who are reportedly now accounting for almost 39% of the workforce. What are your thoughts?
Yes, the problem of irregular workers is an endemic problem that is really global, but in Korea, the percentage of irregular workers in the whole workforce is actually much higher than in any other country. What it comes down to is that we have to uphold the principle of equal pay for equal work. We often have workers working on the same assembly line. One is a regular worker, the other is an irregular worker. And although they're doing exactly the same work, exactly in the same efficient way, produce the same number of widgets, the regular worker gets paid 1/3 more than an irregular worker. It should be that the employer actually needs to pay or must pay more for irregular workers, because they get the benefit of flexibility by employing irregular workers. They don't get the normal protection of labor standards law, and so they can be hired and fired at will. They don't get the usual standard holiday pay, sick leave, pension benefits, etc., etc. And so those costs should really be added onto the irregular workers' wages, and they should be earning more than regular workers. But the reality is that it is for the employer at least 50% cheaper to hire irregular worker than a regular worker. So unless we address that disparity, unless we make it more expensive for employers to hire irregular workers, this problem is not going to go away.
Right, a valid point there. Professor An, early last year, the topic of universal basic income gained quite a bit of attention here in the local front amid efforts to address youth unemployment and, of course, the pandemic itself. Do you see this particular topic as re-emerging to the forefront in the wake of a new administration this coming May?
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah, it will come back because it's a very sensitive issue. So it's social issue again, and it doesn't matter which side. It doesn't matter about your political spectrum. It's the social issue, right? It's not a political issue. So whoever become a president, next president, he have to handle this situation. But once again, it's a sharing of pie. And if someone getting more or somebody getting less, or if everyone get more, it means that you have to get more government budget. Means that you have to increase tax. That will be resistance to tax increase as well, right? So if we want to, they talk about the carbon tax as well, right? One of the options, but still, it's about the social issue, social equity issue. How we're gonna, who is get it? It's a really difficult question. But I think that the beginning point is that you need to get a general consensus. Whatever they do, they have to listen to the people, how other people think of the rest of Korean people community as a big country, and then how we handle it, and we have to get kind of a consensus on process. So which needed future.
Right, so we are talking about a public consensus on the issue. Right. Professor Jo, yet another crucial task for the next administration is stabilizing housing prices. Now, in what direction should relevant policies seek to flow, do you think?
Increase supply, but housing stock is not like any other goods. You can't build a house overnight for people to move in. Now, both of the leading two candidates have promised to build something like between 2.5 million to 3 million houses, and 2/3 of them in the capital city region, in Seoul and in Gyeonggi area. But the fact is we don't have land available for it. So unless they are able to somehow conjure up, empty land from somewhere, which is impossible, I really don't see how they're going to fulfill those campaign pledges. The only candidate with realistic housing policy to me was Shim Sang-jung, the Justice Party candidate. And she was much more realistic in terms of what is actually possible in the next 5 years, 10 years, and also trying to spread out the development over the entire country and not just focused in the Seoul and Gyeonggi region. But the problem is the housing market at the moment is now cooling, or many people believe that it's now beginning to cool. And so by the time that these candidates are able to actually put into effect their policies, the market conditions will have changed so much that it may lead to an oversupply. Now, a really big concern is that we end up going the way that Japanese real estate market went when the bubble burst in the 90s, and they essentially suffered 20, 30 years of stagnation. And everybody agrees that right now the Korean real estate prices are simply just too high. It's completely overpriced compared to actual value. But I really don't see any of the main candidates having a realistic policy to address this. They are promising to increase stock, but that's not going to happen within the time that's actually necessary. And particularly for the Conservative Party candidate, he's going to leave the development to the private sector, which has brought all the ills that we know that is existing in our current housing market. And so unless we actually look at the fundamental problem of how we treat houses as investments rather than actual accommodation, and change our mentality about real estate market, we are going to have this kind of cycle of boom and bust over and over again.
Right, a very vicious cycle, of course. Professor An, moving on to matters related to the Korean Peninsula, what can you tell us about the two leading candidates' pledges with regard to North Korea's nuclear ambitions?
Yeah, very interesting question. I thought about the issues, many times, and then basically idea is that the Lee Jae-myung, candidate Lee Jae-myung, and he's thinking about snapback approach, basically that let them do it and let them give another chance basically. And then the other side, Yoon Suk-yeol, right, candidate Yoon Suk-yeol is more like keep maintaining status quo, means that maintain the sanction, and let them come back by themselves, right? But however, maybe I ask myself, are we asking the right question, or maybe perhaps we're asking wrong question, because that, our goal is the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, basically North Korea, and however the North Korean regime do not want denuclearization, right? They want, it's kind of a contradicting their position, right? So I think that one of the things we can do at this moment, whoever get elected for the future, we need to get a communication channel open. I mean, really something we talk, what we really want, because that, as you see, since like perhaps last 5 or even 10 years, South Korean society having changed dramatically, right? And then I also believe that North Korean public also changing their mind, but they don't even express as much as we do in South. But so I think that we need to kind of create a channel to talk to the other side also. And then perhaps I was thinking maybe we can send someone, like we can send someone, right, to as the envoy, right? That doesn't have to be Korean, I'm thinking that someone who willing to talk, they like to talk. I was thinking maybe former President Donald Trump sent to Pyongyang, maybe talk openly, themselves, or have some kind of a interview officially, and then let them talk, what they want to say. Perhaps there is something misunderstanding. Maybe perhaps, and there's maybe some small ground we can settle, and as a starting point, I think that's the things we need to do. Let's open communication channel, and yeah.
Right, so engage them in dialogue.
Yeah.
Professor Cho, what more now can you share with us about the two contenders' diplomatic agendas once in office?
Well, I would say that Lee, in terms of international relations sphere, seems to be more of an institutionalist, a liberal, or not neoliberal in the Washington consensus type of way, but neoliberal in the sense that he believes in dialogue and cooperation. And this sort of shows up particularly with regard to North Korea and security issues. Professor Ahn has already talked about this, but Lee talks about engaging in a more flexible approach with North Korea, continuing to persuade North Korea, working with North Korea to try to make them give up nuclear weapons and expand alliance and work more closely with the Quad and so on. Whereas Yoon seems to take a much more hardline approach. So he seems to be much more of a neo-realist than anything else. He talks about working much more closely with Washington to confront North Korea's growing nuclear threat. He's even talking about developing technology that would allow us to launch a preemptive strike against North Korea in the event of an imminent nuclear threat from North. And so those are the kind of things that are actually quite belligerent to my ears. He also talks about forming a trilateral security network with Japan and US, something that the Korean government has been, for successive administrations, resisting despite very strong urging from Washington to form this kind of hub and spoke model of Northeast Asian security network, with sort of Japan being at the center and Korea being at one of the spokes. Now, this was pointed out in one of Yoon's public debates. It would mean that Japanese troops may land on Korean soil if, in the event of warlike situation. And this is something that Korean people are not really ready to accept. And so on those security issues, we really see a very divergent views of two candidates.
Right, we do. All right, Professor Cho, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. Professor Ahn here in the studio, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of the Daily Report. Do stay tuned to Arirang News for updates on the presidential election throughout this Wednesday. Thank you for now.